We are in week number 4 of this series that we've titled Downfall. Digging through 1 Kings and examining what it means to walk in obedience to God. What do we have the things that we can learn about how the kings messed up? If you read through 1 Kings and into 2 Kings, you see that this is not like the Who's Who Hall of Fame. In fact, if you've done any reading along 1 Kings with us, you see that this is the list of like how terrible they were. Right? This is the list of how the kings messed up. And the root of that is because they are sitting either in exile or they are after exile, but they're looking back. The writers of this are looking back and saying, how did we end up in this mess? How did we end up so far away from God that the only way that He could wake us up was to send us as a people into exile? See, when God called these people out of Egypt to be His people, He said, I will be your God and you will be my people. We'll have this covenant relationship. Like, all you need is to walk in obedience before me. All you need is to allow me to lead you. And we see throughout Exodus this incredible way that God led them through a pillar of fire and a cloud, and He provided for them. But then they arrived, finally, after years of wandering in the desert, they arrived at their land that they were to inherit. They got comfortable. They looked around and they said, we got a pretty sweet gig here, but it's just not quite enough. We need to be like our neighbors next door. I mean, they just repainted their house. They put on a new deck. We got to be like them. They started looking around and they said, oh, he only works like a 9 to 3 job, and I'm there from 8 to 5. We got to change some things. Rather than walking in obedience before God, they started to look at their neighbors. And they said, our neighbors are led by humans. Like, yeah, it's great that God wants to lead us, but really we need somebody with flesh on. We need somebody that can lead us like a king. And so God in His graciousness raises up Saul to lead them, this king who by earthly standards had it all figured out. He was tall, he was strong, he was wise, but he was human. And he failed to lead them. And so from Saul, then we get to David, and then we get to David's son Solomon. And even the best that we could say was David, a man after God's own heart, failed to lead the people of God the way that God would. Right? That's kind of a little bit of a no-brainer, that humans can't lead people as well as God would. But this is the reality in which we're walking into this series called Downfall, is what can we learn about these kings and the downfalls they had, and how do we glean from that, now walking in the light of the resurrection, now walking in the hope of having Jesus Christ, who died on the cross and was raised from the dead and offers us new life. How do we avoid some of the pitfalls and the downfalls that some of these kings did as well? One of the big questions that 1 Kings asks is a very similar question to many of the people around us. If God is so good, if God is so powerful, if God is so strong, then why are we in this mess? If God is so strong and so good, why do bad things happen? Not just why do bad things happen to good people, but why do bad things happen? This is the same question that 1 Kings is asking as they look back. If God is so good, if God can truly uphold His promises, then why are we in this mess? Why is Jerusalem in ruins? Why is there no longer a king in David's family line still on the throne? So that's the question that's being posed. If you've missed any of the past 3 weeks, I encourage you to hop online and catch up with us. Hear some of the history behind this 1 Kings series. Hear some of these downfalls, some of these pitfalls, the way that Solomon, who was the wisest man to ever live, the richest man to ever live, but that wasn't enough. And he chose to turn his back on the God who provided them. It was because of the sin and the downfall of the leaders, because of their poor leadership as representatives of God, that there would be division in this kingdom. See, when Saul leads as king, when David leads as king, when Solomon leads as king, it's one united kingdom. But because of Solomon's sin, God says, I'm going to rip this apart. I'm going to divide your kingdom. My people will no longer be called one people, but they will be divided. And because of that, because their hearts are not going to continue to turn back to me, they're going to be hauled off into exile. And we see that happen in the next couple of hundred years. But some are taken off by the Babylonians, some are taken off by the Assyrians, and they are hauled out into captivity. And all the wealth that Solomon gained, and the beautiful temple that he had, and the beautiful palace that he had, and we saw last week, is just desolated. What should have been this great proclamation of God's kingdom on earth laid in ruins. So this morning, I want to encourage you to open with me to 1 Kings chapter 16. If you don't have a Bible with you this morning, there's one in the seat that you're sitting on or in front of you or next to you. I want to encourage you to open up to 1 Kings, beginning in chapter 16. 1 Kings is in the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 and 2 Samuel, and then we see 1 Kings. And together, 1 and 2 Kings chronicle for us this picture, looking back. How did we end up in this mess? And hopefully with a heartful intent that we don't end up in this mess again. I want to remind you of where we've been last week. Because of the refusal to obey and fully worship God, because of his willingness to worship other gods, or to allow the worship of other gods to continue, King Solomon is told that his kingdom will be divided. We saw this in 1 Kings 11:33. It says, "I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Shamash, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." See, he points out what they did wrong, and then he recommunicates what his intent was for these leaders. He says, "If you do whatever I command you and walk in obedience to me and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this. Because of their sin, I will humble them, but not forever." But not forever. I just want to hit pause and look at the wonder of this, that even in the exile or post-exile, this is sitting here looking back saying, we screwed up, but aware that God is not done with them yet. This is pre-Jesus. That they're recording this and aware that God punishes their sin. God holds them accountable for their sin. God holds judgment for sin, but he is not finished with them yet. There's incredible power in this, but not forever. See, God is about to move, and he's going to move incredibly through Jesus. And one of the things we've tried to do in this series is to connect 1 Kings with the portrait forward of looking to Jesus, how Jesus is the perfect king. God is pointing forward toward Jesus. For Israel and for you and I this morning, we were never made to place our hope and authority in mere human leadership. God himself is the only one worthy of our praise, our adoration, our affection, and who can truly lead us without fault except for God himself? And he sets to do this through Jesus. So we pick up in 1 Kings chapter 16 at the end of this. And between 11 and 16, it chronicles all these kings who chose poorly. A few that did better, but most of them they did not do what God commanded them to do. And right before this, we have a king named Omri who it says, just does pure evil. But then he has a son. In verse 29, in the 38th year of King Asa of Judah, remember we got two different tribes now, two different kingdoms now. So we got King Asa of Judah. In his 38th year of his reign, Ahab, the son of Omri, became the king of Israel. And he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Talk about a Dundee that you don't want to get, right? Like if it's bad that your dad did a lot of bad things, maybe you should wise up to that, but instead Ahab looks at his dad and is like, "Oh, you did terrible stuff? Just wait until you see what I'm going to do." He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. You lump all of the junk, all of the nonsense, all the mess, all the sin that the former kings did, and all the things that caused the kingdom to be divided, and that just barely tips the bucket into what Ahab did. Because one of Ahab's things is he looks at this and he says, well, my kingdom's not really that strong. God's not really that more powerful, so I got to make a strategic alliance here with a neighboring kingdom, and he marries Jezebel. But not only is it a strategic alliance, but now he allows Jezebel to, in all senses of the word, rule the kingdom for him. She is proclaiming this other king, this other god, this idol, Baal. And she brings all that with her, all that junk with her, and he not only sees this and accommodates this, but he begins to worship Baal. He sets up high places for Baal. and he divides the worship of God. There's some hilariousness in this, that this Baal is supposedly the god of fertility, the god of crops, the god of rain, the God who makes the flowers flower and the grasses grow and the plants and good agriculture. So Baal is the one. If you got a bumper crop, Baal is the one who did that for you. And if you want that next year, you got to worship Baal. And it's against that backdrop of this worship of this idol, this created thing called Baal, that has now infiltrated and became a national religion of Israel. It's against that backdrop that we enter into 1 Kings 17. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will neither be dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." This picture that God has of he's going to dethrone this idol that they have constructed and placed as an act of their worship, because he's not content with them giving their worship and their adoration any place except for him. He's not content with them continuing to worship this thing, thinking that this is what provides for them. No, this is the God who all throughout their story has provided for them. But yet they look at that and say, I think it was this metal bowl structure over here that provided for us. I think that's where our real hope comes from. And you and I snicker, you and I laugh at that because we think about, well, how crazy would that be? But we do that all the time, don't we? We do that all the time with our materialism. This god Baal was the one who provided for their material goods. Oh, now we're hitting at an idol that we like to worship called materialism. But don't go there, Pastor. I don't really want to be uncomfortable today. I don't really want you to reveal how we worship material, how we worship riches, how we look after what we can protect of our riches, of our gain. Do we worship God, or do we worship the material goods around us? Do we fully worship God, or have we allowed, like Solomon, this additional worship to come in? Where, I'll worship God as long as it doesn't strike against this other God, this seeking of material goods, of more finances for me, of more stuff for me, because that's where I find my identity and my reality. I've got to have that next new great thing. Like, are we like Solomon? Are we like Ahab, where we say, you know what? God really doesn't provide for it. Get out of the window, God. I really want to seek this. This is what provides for me. Yeah, I'll show up on Sunday morning, but the source of my identity, the source of my hope, is lodged completely in what I have and what I can earn myself. My identity is wrapped up in what my paycheck is, what my title at work is, what I have, what I own. Oh, it's a little bit different than worshiping this golden cow, but it's all the more real for us, isn't it? So easy to slip into this worship of the things that we have rather than the God who provides these things. Now in chapter 17, we're introduced to Elijah, and we have no other intro to him. I didn't skip over things where it talks about him. Literally, chapter 16 ends, and then 17 begins, and there's no intro to Elijah. Ahab, on the other hand, we know his whole line and how he got there, who his dad was, what the kings before him was. Elijah shows up on the scene. All we know about is, they say, the Tishbite from Tishbe. We don't even know where that is. Ultimately, it's Elijah, the wanderer, the guy came from nowhere, backwardsville, hillbilly land, and he just shows up on the scene. But who was following what God had instructed? It's Elijah, right? This one from Nowheresville, this one who has no back history, no backstory, no reason that he should know what to do was right. The kings had every reason to do what was right. They knew what to do. There was not confusion about doing what was right. So we look at Elijah and we look at Ahab and we ask this question, who is God and who am I? There's a lot that we don't know about Elijah's story, but what is very clear is that long before he steps into the court of Ahab, long before he says, hey, there's not going to be any rain nor dew, there's not going to be any moisture whatsoever. Long before that, He'd thrown off the blinders of wealth and power and found his identity in the God who holds all power and all riches. And it was because Elijah was able to see God that he was able to see his own identity. Ahab's identity was wrapped up in his wealth and his materialism and what he could gain, what he could get. If I worship this, then maybe I'll get more things. Because Elijah was able to see God, he was able to see his own identity. His identity was not wrapped up. His own identity was not intertwined with someone else or something else. His identity was rooted in the reality that the one true God had called him to be his. Elijah knew the words of Exodus 6 that said, God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan where they resided as foreigners, where they are now. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people. I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians, and I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Elijah saw his identity in Exodus chapter 6, and what do you see precipitated God stepping into their story? What did the Israelites do to earn God's favor? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Elijah here sees his identity as one who is chosen and redeemed. These very words in Exodus 6, chosen and redeemed, and that made all the difference for the boldness with which he lived. I mean, imagine for a second the boldness and the courage that it would take to step into Ahab, who the footnote says did more evil than all the kings before him, to step into Ahab's court and say, don't know if you know this, but you think you're leading well, you're actually leading really poorly. Now, granted, there's a lot more to this, since the king could have had you killed with a drop of his finger. But imagine this. Imagine going to the President of the United States at any given time, not saying anything about any current or past presidents, just saying, imagine going to somebody with authority and saying, you're a lousy president, you lead poorly, your priorities are all messed up, you won't pass any legislation, unemployment's going to go through the roof, we're going to have a huge recession, worse than the Great Depression, our military might is defenseless, and you're the laughingstock of world leaders. Oh, and your breath stinks. Like, imagine the courage and the boldness and the craziness that it would take to do that. It would take some boldness. And it would take knowing what your identity is, because that is not going to be received well, very likely, right? It's not very likely it's going to be received well. Elijah does this because his identity is one that is already set as someone who has been chosen and redeemed. His identity is in who he is, not what he does. If his identity was in what he did, then he would have needed to change his tune to be more favorable. But because he knows his identity is that he is chosen and redeemed by the God who truly lives, nothing else matters, and what he does flows out of that. Now, if you're doing the message notes with you this morning, oftentimes we write these in third person, and this is very first person. Because it is imperative that you understand this morning that my identity is that I am chosen and that I'm redeemed. Elijah understood that he was chosen and he was redeemed, and that made all the difference in the courage and the boldness to walk obediently in what God was doing. And we're going to get to that in the next point. But it is imperative that we understand that my identity, your identity, is that you are chosen and you are redeemed. And if you're doing the message notes this morning, and I hope you are, I hope that as you write this, you're able to internalize that and be like, boom, this is me. This is who I am. If everything else was washed away, if I had no job, if I had no family, if I had no house, if I had nothing to stake a claim in, I am firmly rooted because my identity is that I am chosen and I'm redeemed. I don't care who you are, I don't care where you've been, I don't care if this morning is the first morning that you woke up out of a coma and you've heard very little or nothing about Jesus, your identity is that you are chosen and you are redeemed. And I hope that as you write that this morning, that I am chosen, I am redeemed, that begins to take root. Because you must be before you do. Oftentimes in the church, we get this messed up. We think you got to start doing a bunch of things, and then we'll talk to you about what you are and who you be. But no, we have to rest in this. You must be before you do. We must understand that our identity as ones who have been bought with a price, purchased at a price, the price of God's own perfect, holy Son, who we were enemies with, but we have been now brought near. We have been reconciled. We've been redeemed. We have been chosen by God, the same one who created us. This is our friend. This is our identity, friends. This is not a light addition to who we are, but a radical imparting of who we are. And nothing, hear me, nothing else matters. If you walk out of here this morning hearing nothing else of what is yet to come or what I've said previous to this, hear this because it makes all the difference. That there is a God who loves you, who sees you, and who has given you the identity of being his very own son or daughter, his chosen, his redeemed, because you were broken and empty. And that is who you are. And it makes all the difference. And this is problematic for us because if we think about who we are in the wrong way, thinking that we have to do things, it becomes problematic. What did you do to earn this identity of being chosen and redeemed? Absolutely nothing. Zilch, zada, zip, zero. It was given to you while you were still a mess, broken, empty, and poor. But if it's your identity and you don't know it's your identity, then it's time you picked up your name tag, wrote that truth on there, and received it. Because nothing else matters. All right, back to 1 Kings. Off my giant soapbox, back to 1 Kings. Verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. He just gave this proclamation that there would be no rain, no dew. The word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Similar daily provision that the Israelites experienced in the desert, but a very unlikely source, isn't it? Oftentimes, when God calls us to obedience, it's in a way that we don't expect. And he provides for us in ways that we weren't looking for. See, because we know that we are chosen and redeemed, we understand that our identity then leads us to obey God's call, even and especially and often in the face of our own comfort. Another golden bowl, another golden idol that we construct. Right? We got materialism, things that make me things that make me wealthy, things that I find my identity in, and then we got comfort. Another thing that we like to bask in and trust more than God. Yes, even comfort can be a god. We're often not willing to be obedient to God because we value our comfort and our own control. Can I confess this morning that following Jesus is hard? Trusting God to work in the circumstances of your life and those around you is hard, which is why it's so vitally important that we understand our identity, because we will get derailed every single time from obeying God if we do not understand our identity. 1 Kings 17 continues, sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Now I want to put a quick time out. Of all of 1 and 2 Kings, this has nothing, this little story in here has nothing to do with kings, has nothing to do with the Israelites, except for Elijah and his proclamation that there be no dew. It's incredible that this is included. But it shows the heart of God, and I want you to see this. Because where, like the ravens, is his provision? The widow. Somebody who should have had no resources to help out anyone else. Verse 10, so he went to Zarephath, this place that is not in Israel, this place that is in the heart of Baal worship country, because God is about ready to undo this worship of Baal. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? And as she was going to get it, because she was obedient to that, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Zarephath, the heart of enemy country. I mean, you talk about a missional influencer. That's part of our DNA. That's part of our mission statement, right? We will believe that we are called to be missional influencers in Omaha and beyond. This is exactly what is about to happen with Elijah. He's setting off into the heart of enemy country to influence for the mission of God. An insider and an outsider. Sometimes those around us are just family waiting to hear the good news that they are part of a family. The fact that this is included in the Chronicle of the Kings of Israel is evidence that God already was looking beyond his people into a people that would be called by his name, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of where they were proximity-wise. Think about that for a second. The people that you encounter on a daily basis, whether your family, whether your neighbors, whether your coworkers, people that you see in the store, people that right now have no relationship with God, or have been called by him, have been chosen by him, have been redeemed by him. They just don't know it yet. They're truly your family members. They just don't know it yet. Think of them as an estranged family member, somebody who thinks that dad's still angry at them or that dad's left. And you're like, no, let me make this more clear to you. Let me reach out to you like Elijah to this widow. I don't know what your story is, but let me make it very clear that God, that dad, you're part of my family, that dad's not angry with you. In fact, dad has chosen you. Dad has redeemed you. Dad has done everything to draw you into him. We gotta skip this idea of having like these widows and Zarephath ideas that people just exist and someday somebody will reach them maybe. We gotta be like Elijah and engage with people's story, being obedient to go where God calls us. Verse 12, as surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. You know, my kids are dramatic sometimes. It's so hot, I'm going to die. I'm so bored, I'm going to die. That's not her story, right? Like, she's literally saying, this is what I've got left. Everything is so messed up. Baal has failed us so badly. There is no provision in the land. Like, literally, this is all I've got left. And I'm preparing to die. I don't know what happens after that because the God that I placed my identity in has failed me. There's surely nothing left for me. But I know that this is the last thing that's going to fill my tummy and then I'm going to die. My son and I are going to die. She lives in this nation where the local God is supposed to provide fertility, wealth, riches, crops, water, and plenty, but she doesn't have any of that. Friends, this is heartbreaking because this is the exact same world that we live in, isn't it? The world does so much harm to those around us, our neighbors, our family members, our coworkers. It promises so much and actually provides so little. The gods of this world, be it wealth, status, athletics, work, sex, pleasure, prestige, offer the life that you've always wanted, but instead provide brokenness, pain, emptiness, worthlessness, and despair. She's arrived at the realization that maybe Elijah's God isn't dead, but hers is. She says, hers is dead, but maybe this God that you have, maybe he's still living because you look like you've had a couple more meals than I have. We all have people around us like this, don't we? That are feeling like I'm at the end of this and I've got nothing left. They've placed their hope and it's left them devastated and hopeless. Apart from God, there is no hope. Apart from God, there is no hope. If you understand that your identity is that you're chosen and redeemed, you're saying amen to this. Because you've seen how your life has been transformed. But apart from God, there is no way to have God and something that's going to provide more hope. No, apart from God, there is no hope. And so Elijah says to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, who you do not worship yet, but who has entered into your store, who has chosen you, who is going to redeem you, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. And so she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and for her family, for the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. See, if hope does not exist apart from God, why does hope exist? Hope exists because God is true to his promises, because he can actually back up what he says he will do. They were worshiping this God. You and I worship gods all over the place that we think are going to provide for us, but they do not do what they say they will do. They're empty promises every time, but hope exists for you and I, for our friends and for our coworkers, for our family members who do not yet know that they are chosen and redeemed, because God is true to his promises. Short time later, and I'm not going to read these verses for us this morning, but a short time later, this woman's son does actually die. And by an incredible miracle, Elijah is able to raise this boy back to life. And in a very similar account, in a very similar area, Jesus does the same thing in Luke chapter 7. It says, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, when Jesus saw her, his heart went out to her and said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier, the casket they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." Elijah had to stretch out his body over this boy 3 times to raise him. Jesus literally just says, "Get up." And the dead man sat up and began to talk. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. And they were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. God has come to help his people. In fact, Jesus didn't just come to temporarily raise people from the dead or to meet the needs of his people. No, he came for all people in an eternal kind of way. John 11, Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." And he says to Martha, "Do you believe this? Have you placed this identity that you are chosen and redeemed? Do you have this identity and this hope that I am the God who fulfills promises?" Not just do you have head knowledge of this, but is it beginning to work in your heart and in your will? And finally, Romans says, "For I'm convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything in all creation, nothing, not even death, will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." See, God's promise of resurrection provides the greatest hope. I feel like this has been a heavy week for us ministerially. There's some things going on in the lives of the people seated around you and in this community that are heavy. And I think it's made worse by the fact that we have all these gods around us that we're seeking hope for, that we're seeking comfort for, that we're seeking wealth for, that we're seeking to find our identity in. And it's that much more necessary. The crazier that the world gets, that we live into this hope, that we hold tightly, that the resurrection provides the greatest hope. Because I don't care what circumstance you're walking into. I don't care if it's death itself. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. And Jesus' resurrection, and the fact that he is extending that to us, that he has chosen us, that he has redeemed us, and the resurrection awaits us, provides the greatest hope from God himself. There's a lot of us this morning carrying the weight of the broken world that we live in. A world full of family members, neighbors, coworkers who are looking for fulfillment in all the wrong, empty, broken places. But there is one who steps into their story and who has already stepped into their story. And because our identity is in who he is and what he has done, he calls us to be obedient to step alongside him into the stories of those around us, engaging with the hard, the painful, the difficult, and bringing the hope of the resurrection to bear in this world. There is nothing that can separate us from the love of God, and there is nothing that God cannot yet speak his resurrection into. He is the God of great hope, and he leads us to trust him for our good, for our neighbor's good, and for the glory of God himself. Friends, would you pray with me?